So this video is going to get a bit more in depth and it might be a bit harder to keep up with, but we'll see how we go. Alright, so let's get rid of these for now. So essentially what we're going to do in this video is we're going to connect to our database. We're going to create two data sets called pageConfig and siteConfig, and siteConfig will hold all of our site configurations, our names, our titles, and everything like that. A lot more in the future. And our pageConfig will be individual page configs for each page, which will have the URL that the page is on, the title for it, the name for it, the authentications. But for right now, we're just going to worry about the name and the URL for that. So let's get started. So first off, we need to connect to our database, and we need a dependency to use our database. Let's install Mongoose, which is allowing us to connect to MongoDB. Let do its thing. While it's doing its thing, let's actually add another file, and we're going to call this one database config, and we're going to name a folder called connection, which is going to connect to our database. Let's come down here, and let's say database config, say const database connection is equal to, let's require that connection file that we just created. We want to use it. So database connection, run it as a function. And it comes up with an error because we have nothing in there, sending back to the server file. So let's do that. We'll start off with our dependencies. Mongoose. Then we're going to have our database connection. Database connection is going to pull in no arguments. And then we are going to export that. Export is equal to that database connection. And that clears up our error. So now we want to connect to our database. So, nice and simple, mongoose.connect. Now we need to pass through a URL for that database. And that error popped up because we haven't got a URL. We're not going to hard code that into our database. We're actually going to put that into our environmental variables. So let me just copy and paste our URI, and I'll put that into our environmental variables. So db URI is equal to that. Alright, cool. So now we have our URI in our environmental variables. We can actually bring that across over here. So let's say const db URI is equal to process.env.db URI. So now we can use that here. And just like with our listen, we want to create an anonymous function that pulls in an error. We want a console.log, either an error or saying database connected. Save you. What are we looking at? Got an error here. Operation will be switched to false. Okay, so that is pretty much saying deprecation. Okay, so there's been an update since we've used this last. So all it wants to do is add something else to it. So I want to say mongoose.set strict query to false. If I can type correctly, and there we go, that's fixed up that deprecation. That was the first time I've actually seen that error. Nice. Okay, so anyway, we're connected to our database. So we can close out of that because we are done with it. Next, we want to create our data set for that siteConfig, and to do that we need to create a model. Let's come into our database config, let's create a models file and create siteConfig. Alright, first thing, dependencies that we're going to use in this file should be mongoose. Mongoose. First thing we want to do is we want to create a schema. So const siteConfig is equal to a mongoose schema, and in here we're just going to say pretty much what key value pairs that we want to have. So first one is going to be title, which will be a string, and that title is going to hold this value up there. And the next one is name, which is just a string as well. And that is just going to be our headings for our site. Next, with that schema, we want to create a model. So we're going to say const siteConfig is equal to mongoose.model. And we're going to give that model a name, which is siteConfig. I need to give it some schema, which is siteConfig being this variable up there. That's it for our model. Now we can just export that out. That's it, we've exported our siteConfig. Now let's create that data set, because right now, let's just connect into our database with the GUI. So this is the GUI for the database. We don't even have rate my poly there, nothing else. All right. So what we want to do, let's just come down here, create an anonymous function out in the open. This has to be an asynchronous function because we have to wait for a response from another place. So first of all, we want to bring in our siteConfig model that we created. There it is. And now we want to say, we want to await for a new siteConfig. And once we get that, we want to save it. Now, what we want to pass through is title, which will make rate my poly. And then we want the name also to be rate my poly. I'll create a UI for you guys to change this later, so you don't have to do this hard coding stuff. All right, let's save that. Everything's passed. Let's comment that out so we don't accidentally put two records in for that. Now if we go back to our GUI, we will refresh you. Now we've got our rate my poly database in here. We have our site configs. We look at that and there's what we've just put in. So rate my poly and rate my poly for title and name. So what we want to do with that is every time somebody goes to ratemypoly.com, or in this case localhost, they hit enter, it requests from the server. And we want to automatically pull that data from the database every time somebody requests a web page. We want to add that to the local variables for that web page and automatically send it down so we don't have to manually do it every time. And to do that, we create something called middleware. The reason we call it middleware is if we go back into our routes. So what happens is somebody requests a get request for route slash. So it'll look for route slash, it'll look for get, and then it'll run this function. A middleware function will run between them making the request and us running this function there. So it'll literally sit just there. And what we're going to do is we're going to set it that that middleware is going to automatically pop up in every single request that is made. So what we're going to do is we're going to create middleware that's going to pull through that data from the database, and it's going to save it into our response. So it'll automatically be sent down as a response to client every time we make a response back to the client, pretty much. Okay, so let's go back to our server file. We can get rid of that now. So we want to create our middleware. So let's just create another folder here. Middleware, siteConfig. There we go. Now on our server page, we want to require that. Middleware const siteConfig is equal to require that file we just created. And now we want to say we want to use it. App.use siteConfig. Okay, that's going to throw an error because our siteConfig file isn't sending anything back to our server file. Okay, if you look here, we have two app.uses. We can throw them into the same app.use, but I want to split it up so that way this app.use will only contain stuff that we pulled in as the dependency, where this app.use, we will bring in anything, any middleware that we've created ourselves. That way it separates it out. So if later on we have an error, we can easily track down whether it's a dependency error or something that we've hard-coded ourselves. So let's go into our siteConfig, and first of all, we'll check out our error. siteConfig is not a function, so what we can do is we can create a function for that. So I'll say our middleware function on siteConfig is equal to an anonymous function. Go, and we can respond, export that back to the server page. Module.exports is equal to siteConfig. Now, what's this error? When we save this now, it's a different error. And the reason for that is we're saying app.use requires a middleware function, which is what this is, but we're not sending back a middleware function. A middleware function needs to have request and response in it, and then something else called a next. So what we're going to want to do is now we're going to want to return back to our server a request, our response, and our next. So essentially what these are is a request, we've been able to get any data from the request made by the client. Response, we will have access to this response that we'll be sending back down to the client. So anything we want to add, we can add to our response. And next is called just so we can say move on with the next part of the function. So right here, if we had our middleware that's going to sit there, if we don't say next, it's not going to move on with this. So just for example, we've got that saved right now. We try to run our page, it's just going to hang because it's not moving on to the next part of the function. So if we're throwing next there, we save that, we rerun our page, it can move on. All right, nice and easy. So the function of this will be pull down that siteConfig data from our database, and we want to put it into our response variable. So the first thing we need to do is have access to that database model. So we're going to say database models const siteConfig is equal to require that model that we created earlier. siteConfig models siteConfig. Cool. So the first thing we want to do is we want to pull down that data. So we want to say const, let's just call it config, is equal to, now because this is coming from a database, we need to wait for a response. We're going to say await siteConfig.find1. So first thing we want to do is, because we're using await, it needs to be part of an asynchronous function, so we have to mark it as asynchronous. Now we want to search for something. Now, in our database, this is our record, and we want to search for the ID. So we're going to throw that into our environmental variables. So we're going to say siteConfig ID is equal to that ID. So now what we can do is we can go const ID is equal to process.env.siteConfig ID. Now we can tell our query to search for the ID. And we've pulled that down into there. So what we need to do now is we pulled in that. Actually, first let's make sure that we have that properly. So it's console.log our config. There you go. And we can see nothing's popping up in the console because the only time this function is ever going to be called is when a page's request is made. So let's refresh that. No. So we're coming back with an error because we're not pulling down anything. So let's check out what we've got here. So we've got const IDs process.site. I didn't save our environmental variables. All right, we should not have an issue now. Let's refresh that page. Refresh. No. Awesome. Still coming down wrong. Why are you having issues? siteConfig ID. siteConfig ID. Oh wait, siteConfig.find1 by the ID. All right, let's just check this out. So we'll just say console.log the ID, refresh the page, what comes up? Okay, so we're actually getting a response that time. I don't know why I was having a bit of a hiccup there, but yeah, as you can see, every time we refresh the page, we are getting that data there from the database. Cool. So what we want to do now is we want to inject that into our response. Response.locals, meaning the rendered web page can see it, and let's call it siteConfig is equal to the data we pulled down from config. Nice, we'll just refresh our page, make sure everything still works. Everything still works fine. So what we want to do now is we want to use that. We are done with these. Let's come into our layouts and we can set in our head, say our title is going to be some EJS code, which will be siteConfig.title. And here we are going to have siteConfig.name, which will correspond with those two there. So we save that and we'll refresh our page. There we go, our title's changed to Rate My Poly, and that one stayed the same because it was exactly the same thing. Okay, nice. So that means we can create a UI later, so within the web browser, whoever staff members are or developers are, they can change these variables as we want them. Okay, so the next part of this is we want to be able to set our page name pretty much the same way, store it in a database, so every time somebody loads the web page, it'll search the database for the request, see what page they're looking for, and pull down all the data for that specific page. So again, we're going to do almost the exact same thing as before, but just with a couple of changes. So let's start off by creating some middleware for pageConfig. Cool. We can literally just copy and paste you, put you into there, and let's rename a couple of things. So that and that is actually going to be pageConfig. This one here and this one here will have to be pageConfig. We have to create that model. And actually, why are we putting stuff in here? That should all just be blank for now. Okay, pageConfig, good stuff. So down here we can add that in here. So I'm going to say pageConfig, and we can put it down here too. pageConfig. There we go. So last thing was creating that model. So let's actually copy and paste this model. So change you and you to pageConfig. Change you to be pageConfig. All right. So our schema, we want to leave our name there. We don't need a title. Let's give that URL, which is going to be a string. Cool. So right now, if we go into our pageConfig, we want to pull down, wait, that's models, we want to middleware pageConfig. We want to pull down data for that page, but we don't have any data yet. So let's create that as an anonymous function. pageConfig is equal to require Okay, so I'm actually going to keep this down here for a while because we're going to use this method for now to create the pageConfig for every single page until we do create a UI for it. So let's start. The URL for our home page is /. The name for our home page is home. Cool. Let's save that. We'll comment you out so we don't create multiple records for that. Come back over here. We will refresh our database, and now we have our page configs. And inside there, we have our URL and our home. Nice. So now if we go to our page configs, what we're going to do is, just like before, we're going to search our database. So we're going to say siteConfig. Page config is it that find one. And now we want to find the request from, not the request, find the record in the database by the URL. So the URL is actually stored in the request, request.url. So we can say just search for that URL. Now, first of all, let's console.log the config to make sure that we're getting the correct data, and we definitely want to call next so I can move on with the next thing. All right, so now let's run our page and watch our console. So refresh you. We're not getting anything back. Perfect, that's exactly what we wanted. Okay, so what are we doing wrong here? So we've got our URL const config is equal to pageConfig.find1. All right, let's just make sure our URL is correct. So let's say console.log the URL. Let's refresh you. We're definitely getting that slash through for the URL. That's good, but we're not getting anything back for our config. So let's see. pageConfig is fine. Ah, there's the problem right there. We're looking for siteConfig. Save. Let's refresh you. And there we go. There's our pageConfig. So rather than console logging that out, we want to put that onto our response. So response.locals.pageConfig is equal to config. So now we have access to that. So now let's come back to our layout. And right there, our page name, what we want to say is pageconfig.name. Good. Now if we refresh you, we're getting that. That's exactly what we want. I know it didn't look like anything changed, but that's exactly what we wanted. But something we do want to add into this page config is, say we go to a page that we've created that we don't have a page config for, or we try going to just a random URL that doesn't exist, it's going to throw errors. So what we want to do is we're going to throw a little clause into here, a little error check. So we're going to say, if there's nothing that comes back from config, we want to say response.render an error page, which we will create. We want to pass down some things, so we're going to say pageConfig name is equal to error, and we also want to give it a message. Page not found. Okay, so if nothing is found in our database for its page config, we want it to do that. We actually want it to return that. Okay, so if something is found, we want it to run that. Okay, cool. So let's create that error page. .ejs. Cool, and now let's give it a place to put that error. It's just .error. So now if we go to a random page, messages.error. Okay, so we're picking up an error. Messages is not found. Obviously I typed that in wrong. See, I've got message there. Messages. Refresh that, and there we go. We get page not found. No matter what we type in there, it's going to come up page not found, unless it is part of our page config. Cool. And that will be it for this one.